The courtroom door burst open before the judge could speak. Marcus stood there, mud on his shoes, a trembling envelope in his hand. "This," he said, his voice cracking, "was never meant for me." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd like a gust of wind. Edward froze in his seat, eyes locked on the seal he'd broken years ago. And somewhere in the back, a woman began to cry. Quietly, like someone mourning a truth finally found. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below, and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The runway glittered like a strip of distant stars, wet from a late rain that still clung to the tarmac. In the hush before sunrise, the big jet stood like a sleeping beast, its metal skin cool and perfect, lights steady along the wings. Inside the glass of the terminal, travelers moved as tired ghosts, briefcases, soft eyes, the small private dramas that follow people like shadows. The airport smelled of coffee and cold metal and a hint of perfume someone had forgotten to wash away. It was a place where fortunes crossed paths with hunger, where the polished and the plain briefly shared the same stale air. Marcus sat on a bench near gate 12, the plastic seat hard beneath him, his backpack at his feet. He wore a coat that had once been neat and was now patched at the cuff. His hands were darker from the sun and work. His nails still carried the faint memory of oil and soap. He pressed his palms together and watched people go by, as if he studied them for a secret he could trade for bread. He had the look of someone who had learned to make his face small, to survive without asking too loudly for anything. At 20, Marcus had the practiced calm of a man who had already seen enough disappointment to know how to hold his breath until it hurt. He did odd jobs, loading luggage, carrying bags, cleaning the luxury buses that ferried executives to their flights. He knew the airport's hidden corners, where the staff smoked in the shadows, where the lost umbrellas piled up like small monuments, where cleaners whispered about the lives they wiped away every night. He carried his life in the backpack. A few shirts, a dog-eared Bible, a photograph of a little sister asleep on a cotton mattress, and a thin wallet with a single battered note. This morning, Marcus had an extra reason to be here. He clutched a folded ticket in his pocket, a small miracle he had bought with 2 months of overtime and a favor from a friend who worked IT. It was a cheap economy seat, but it was a ticket out, a chance to bring a package across the ocean for a woman who had once helped his mother. He told himself the job would be quick, drop the parcel at the other end, return before the next shift. He told himself a small lie that any traveler tells when hope sits like a coin in their palm, that everything could change after this flight. Across the concourse, through the glass, men in dark suits moved like chess pieces toward the jet. One of them walked a hair slower than the others, and there was a carefulness in his step that spoke of money bought by rules and habit. Edward Lancaster's shoes were polished to a mirror sheen. Edward never hurried unless it suited him. He wore a ring that gleamed with a quiet arrogance, and his hair was arranged with a precision that had cost more time than his average employee made in a month. He had married success, and the marriage had been kind to him. The company, the homes, the praise. But there was a fissure at the center of him now, a small, private ache he kept folded beneath his shirt, an ache that had become sharper since his wife took to the gallery nights and cocktail hours that filled their calendar like decorative leaves. Edward was holding a baby when he walked, wrapped in a blanket as white as new permission. The child's cheeks were round and flushed, a small complainer in the great hush of the terminal. He cradled the baby with a practiced gentleness that suggested he had been practicing for this tenderness for a long time, or that he read a manual about what tenderness should look like. The baby's eyes were already searching for a world he did not yet know. Edward's jaw tightened once, and he glanced at his phone as if the little screen might hold a line back to the life that had grown complicated. Between Marcus and Edward, a third figure moved with a casual authority that belonged to the crew. Anna, a flight attendant with a soft laugh and a watchful eye, navigated the flow with a balance of cheer and tiredness. She knew the routes of bodies and luggage like a map, She had seen families fall into knots, seen arguments sputter into apologies, watched people do small mercies and smaller cruelties. Today, she felt the edge of something in the air that would not be smoothed by her smile. She paused and watched Marcus on the bench for a moment. He looked like everyone who arrived with a story and no one to sit with it. The narrator looks at this scene in two ways. First, with the compassion of someone who reaches for the soft place in other people's chests. Then, with the distant eye of an observer who counts detail the way a tailor counts stitches. Marcus's fingers tapped an invisible rhythm on the plastic seat. There was a song he could not hum but knew by the pressure of his skin. Marcus watched Edward through the glass, seeing not money but the hollow that sometimes hides behind status. Edward seemed both proud and threadbare, like a man who had paid too high a price for the life he kept. The infant began to cry, a small, trying sound at first, then rising into the bright, demanding wail babies are born with. The sound cut across the terminal, caught at glass and metal and the rising murmur of early departures. Heads turned. Phones lifted like small lighthouses. Edward tightened his hold, his face folding into a look he rarely let anyone see, an expression somewhere between panic and plea. He whispered something that could have been a prayer or a command. The baby's cry did not soften. Marcus stood up without deciding to. He moved on the motion of someone who knew the airport and how easily moments could collapse into other people's lives. He would have been unnoticed if not for the way his eyes met Edward's. A small, honest meeting across a sea of tickets and carry-ons. People around them shuffled, annoyed at the noise. Some offered advice, try the lullaby, feed him, hold him closer, as if experience could be traded like gum. The etiquette of strangers crowed loudly at the edge of the scene. For Marcus, the cry opened a memory like a door. He thought of a night when his little sister had screamed and no one had the money for medicine. He thought of being a child and learning how grief smells in an empty kitchen. That memory was a small thing that fit like a key into the jar of his courage. He could feel his ribs tighten with the urge to help, and not for anything noble, just because it would mean he had done one small, right thing in a world that often forgot to be fair. Edward's eyes met Marcus's again, looking for something he did not name. The passenger's face had the tired hardness of someone used to commanding respect, but there was a break in it now, raw and immediate. He was a man who had bought silence with money. Silence, though, is not a thing that can be bought in an airport. Without fanfare, Marcus crossed the polished floor and stood near them, carrying a quiet that belonged to people who knew how to listen. He did not speak, as the baby kept crying, only looked the way a man looks when he is ready to act, but unsure of the rules. Edward's hands trembled slightly. Around them, the world reassembled its attention. Elderly couples watching, businessmen checking their watches, a mother pulling a toddler closer. "Do you want me to hold him?" Marcus asked. His voice was soft, neither pleading nor seeking reward. It was a small, brave question. Edward blinked, surprised, open-mouthed. For a breath, pride and caution sparred across his face. He seemed to weigh 1,000 small consequences in that second. The safety of a stranger's hands, the oddness of accepting help, the impossible idea that someone like Marcus could be trusted with something so small and so whole. Then Edward, with a slow-motion decision that felt like a surrender and a relief at once, nodded. He set the baby into Marcus's arms with the awkward care of a man who had touched this life often and suddenly felt it stranger, as if the child were a note in a foreign tongue. Marcus felt the weight and the warmth settle against his chest, a living thing that immediately quieted his thoughts. The infant's eyes found Marcus's face, and the world seemed, just for a moment, to line up like stars that had taken a single breath. The baby's crying slowed, then softened into hiccups. Marcus rocked him in a rhythm pulled from the memory of his own mother humming by a kerosene lamp. Edward watched as if he had been given back something. Back what he could not yet say. In the small space between them, something shifted. It was not a grand change, nothing that would be written in the morning papers. It was quieter, a thread that tugged, then held. Anna cleared her throat and smiled in that careful way flight crews do, smoothing the moment with professional warmth. "We should board soon," she said. Her voice was steady, practical. The words were the kind that gather people from the edges of scenes and call them to the next act of their day. Marcus looked up at Edward, then at the baby. The plane's engines would roar soon, deadlines and appointments would reassert themselves like tides. For now, in the dim light near gate 12, two lives touched for a single breath. A millionaire with his careful sorrow, and a poor boy with a backpack full of small hopes. Neither of them yet knew that this brief crossing would not be only a moment. It would be a fault line waiting to happen, a first page of a story that would peel back kindness and claim secrets between its lines. They boarded with the slow, polite shuffle of people who travel often enough to make a ritual of it. The jet exhaled a long metallic breath as the crew guided passengers down the jetway. The cabin smelled of coffee and recycled air, the kind of close, shared smell that makes strangers touch the edges of each other's lives and then step back. Marcus felt the baby's weight steady in his arms, as if the child belonged to him by right for that single hour. The lullaby of the engines and the murmur of voices made him calm in a way the terminal never had. The inciting event arrived quietly, the way storms arrive. First a small note in the air, then a sudden change. It began with a light on a security officer's belt blinking green, then red. A routine random check turned sharp when the scanner at the gate hummed and spat a small alarm. People glanced up, annoyed at the delay. Edward's face tightened. Marcus felt the baby shift, his small hands opening and closing. A security officer came forward, polite but firm. "Random bag check," he said. He looked at Marcus with a professional softness that did not soften the procedure. Marcus, surprised, set the child carefully on his shoulder and unzipped his backpack. The officer's gaze swept over the plane contents. A few shirts, a worn Bible, the small parcel Marcus had been asked to carry by a woman named Rosa. Marcus had promised without thinking. Rosa had smiled at him like gratitude had teeth. Marcus had accepted. The officer's fingers closed around the parcel. It was lighter than he expected. He unwrapped the paper. First a layer of brown parcel paper, then a tidy cloth. The cloth came away to reveal a small metal box, the kind that might hold a keepsake cold and precise in his hand. Marcus's throat went dry. He had never considered what might be inside. Edward watched with a thin line of impatience. His hand found the seat beside him, fingers drumming the armrest. He looked like a man prepared for small annoyances, not for the line of questions that followed. "Sir, did you pack this bag yourself?" the officer asked Marcus. "Yes," Marcus answered. His voice was steady because there was no time for fear to unspool. He told the truth. The bag had been his, the box had been given to him. The officer opened the box. Inside lay a silver locket, its surface scratched by use. Marcus's fingers hovered. He had never seen such a thing in Rosa's hands. The locket was personal, too personal for a simple favor. Someone had folded a scrap of paper and tucked it inside. The officer's thumb brushed the note and unfolded it with careful curiosity. Marcus's name was on the scrap in a hurried hand. But there was another name beneath it, two initials, neat and deliberate. E.L., the same initials that gleamed on Edward Lancaster's ring. The cabin seemed to inhale. Edward's face changed. A small, precise panic clicked through the set of his mouth. He did not reach for the locket, and that made him look smaller than he had earlier when he held the baby with practiced gentleness. People around them shifted away, as if contagion could pass through proximity. Anna had been moving down the aisle, checking tickets and offering smiles. She stopped, watching Marcus and Edward with a new attention. Her professional smile thinned into a line of worry. She had seen things in airports before, luggage that hid secrets, packages that carried lies. She guessed at the wrongness here and felt it twitching in her chest. "What is that?" a woman near the window demanded. Her voice carried the sharpness of someone who did not like uncertainty. Heads turned. The baby, sensing the tension, fussed and then went still like a small animal listening for a sign. Edward's jaw worked once. He said too quickly, "That's mine." He reached out for the locket the way a man reaches for a memory. "You," the officer asked, "you claimed the child." Edward's eyes flicked to Marcus, then to the locket, then back to Marcus. He swallowed and said, with a control that did not mask the tremor, "Yes, it's a family keepsake. I must have dropped it earlier." He sounded practiced, and the sound of it made Marcus's skin prickle. He had never seen a rich man's practiced voice like that, smooth, certain, as if words could rearrange truth. Marcus felt himself shrink and then stretch. He had promised Rosa, and promises clenched tired hands into resolve. "I don't know anything about this," he said. "Rosa gave me the parcel. She said it was for someone at the other end." His voice was small, but honest. Honesty has a way of making itself heard, even when the crowd wants noise. The officer opened the locket and read the scrap aloud, careful where his eyes landed. "Forgive me," he said, "and a date." The date was recent, written in ink that had not yet faded, and a name, Jacob. The name was the baby's, but it hung like a question mark. Marcus felt his heart hit a strange rhythm. How had his parcel come to contain the baby's locket? How had Rosa known to include it? Why would Edward be named in a note tucked into a stranger's package? The narrator narrows, then widens, the compassionate voice whispers from Marcus's ribs, the observer counts seams. Marcus thought of his sister, and the nights he had kept hunger from her by doing favors and carrying others' burdens. He thought of how favors collect like coins until they have weight. He felt suddenly that the weight of this favor was not physical alone. It had a moral heft he had not bargained for. Edward's face darkened. A man who had practiced control now looked naked before the airport lights. He said, "I don't know how it got there. Someone must be playing a trick." The words sounded like a well-cut suit, clean and argued, but the people near him heard the rust of strain. Anna moved closer with the quick step of someone who had been trained to manage small crises. She knelt to be at Marcus's level and saw the baby's soft breath against his neck, the tiny fist unclenching. "Are you all right?" she asked Marcus, though everyone could see he was. His hands trembled, not for the weak, but for the sudden horoscope of complicity that seemed to circle around him. Outside the cabin window, the runway lights blinked, indifferent. Inside, the air felt thicker. The officer pressed on. "We'll need to check further," he said. "We need to know why a passenger's keepsake is in another passenger's parcel." Edward's voice tightened. "Check all you need, but there's been a mistake." He said it like a man who could order mistakes into truths. People listened, some with suspicion, some with the quiet hunger that watches drama for entertainment. Marcus felt something cold press at his throat. He had been careful his whole life, careful with words, careful with jobs. He had not expected his small kindness to become a lever in someone else's story. He thought of Rosa's smile and the way she had thanked him. He felt suddenly very small. The officer took the locket and handed it to Edward, who held it as if it were fragile and dangerous at once. Marcus watched Edward open it. Inside was a faded photograph, two figures at a seaside, a man laughing with a child on his shoulders. Marcus's breath caught. The man in the photograph looked like Edward, if the eyes were the measure. The child's face was half-turned, but enough was visible to know the round cheeks, the small chin, the same geometry as the baby now in Marcus's arms. The photograph's back bore a message in a tidy, slanted script. Marcus could not read it from where he stood, but he felt the words like a slap. Edward closed his fist around the locket, his face folded in a way that made him look, briefly, human in a way richness had kept him from being. Then, quietly, without the noise the crowd expected, Edward stepped away. He moved like a man who had been given a new, dangerous knowledge. He whispered something into the ear of the woman who had been with him, a woman with painted lips and a voice like glass. Her face went pale as pages were turned, and she looked at Marcus for the first time, not with curiosity, but with the quick, sharp weight of suspicion. Something had happened that no one could yet name. A keepsake had crossed hands and created a line that split their lives. Marcus, who had thought himself invisible, found himself watched like a story unfolding. Edward, who had counted on rules and money, discovered that memory and small metal boxes were messy things. Anna saw both of them and wondered at the architecture of this new problem. The narrator steps back, then leans in. The airport, a place for comings and goings, had become a stage. A small metal box had lit a fuse. The promise Marcus had made, the favor he had carried, rested now at the center of a knot. The characters had taken positions without knowing the endgame. There was, in the hush that followed the locket's opening, the beginning smell of betrayal, like rain before thunder, and the shape of the conflict had its first hard edge. They moved into the slow pulse after the incident, as if the airport had inhaled and then held its breath. Marcus sat a little straighter, Jacob nestled against his chest, and for the first time in a long while he felt the strange quiet that comes after an act of courage. It was small and electric, like the hush after a streetlight flicks on. Around him, people resumed the practiced choreography of travel, but the air between Marcus and Edward had changed, thicker now, like cloth dampened by rain. Edward watched Marcus with the careful attention of a man cataloging an unexpected object. He was flanked by Claire, whose painted lips gave her a cruel brightness, and by two assistants who hovered as if their purpose were to catch any falling piece of their employer's life. Claire kept her handbag clutched to her chest as if it were armor. She watched Marcus, not with curiosity, but with the cold assessment of someone who had been schooled in the economy of shame and advantage. Her glance carried questions she thought she did not need asked. Who is he? What does he want? What could he take? Anna stood a little apart, a professional smile, now softened into something real. She had seen Marcus steady the baby and felt the warmth of something honest that could not be bought. She also knew people could surprise you in the worst ways, and the locket with Edward's initials folded into it suggested the world had already begun to rewrite itself. The uniform at her waist felt heavier for reasons she could not name. Her job was to keep people safe, to smooth edges, but the edges here were jagged and personal. Marcus felt the weight of many names in his chest. Rosa, who trusted him, his sister, whose sleeping breath he had learned to protect, the strangers who had watched and whispered. He knew what his place was supposed to be: small, useful, easily overlooked, and yet he felt a new pressure that wasn't shameful. It was the pressure of being seen, of being chosen, however briefly, to hold something sacred. He thought of how easy it had been to be invisible and how strange this new attention felt, like heat spreading under skin. Inside him was a map of old wounds. There were nights when rent swallowed hope, when his mother's cough hollowed rooms, when he had learned to barter a skill or a smile for a night's shelter. Those scars did not show on his grin. They lived in the way he moved his hands when he held the baby, careful, as if the motion could be measured to keep from breaking anything. Marcus's compassion was not a performance. It was a habit born of necessity, a muscle trained by hunger and the memory of a child he used to soothe with a broken lullaby. Edward, too, was not flat. He had places behind his eyes that no suit could cover. His wealth had been bought as surely as a house is bought, with decisions that had rooms beneath them where regret lived. He loved his son in a way that frightened him because love made him vulnerable to a past he thought he had arranged neatly into a display case. The locket was not just jewelry. It was a key to the room he had tried to lock. Seeing Marcus hold Jacob cracked something brittle in him, shame, fear, the realization that money could not always erect walls against truth. Claire's anger was small and sharp like a glass shard. She had married the idea of security, and every imperfection that suggested her safety might be false was a personal affront. She had been taught to keep appearances flawless. An unknown man holding the child, a locket that matched her husband's initial, these things threatened not only privacy, but her curated life. She wanted the scene gone, smoothed, resolved before it could gather a rumor that might stick to velvet curtains and dinner plates. Between Marcus and Edward lay more than the locket. There were streetwise instincts and boardroom habits, two kinds of language that rarely shared all. Marcus felt humility mixed with an ember of pride. He had acted because someone needed help. He had not expected to be dragged onto the stage. Edward felt an annoyance that had the flavor of fear. He had never needed anyone so urgently and found the experience both alarming and intoxicating. It was jarring for him to be seen, not as a patron or buyer of service, but as a man whose life could be questioned by a stranger with honest hands. They spoke around each other, at first. Words were small test probes, polite and cautious. Marcus said, "Rosa asked me to deliver it. She said someone at the other end was waiting." He did not name them, because he did not know. The truth in his tone was a kind of armor that made him speak less like a defendant and more like a witness. Edward's voice was low and controlled. "Rosa," he repeated, tasting the name like a strange spice. There was a flicker in him, a memory that the name had pulled loose. "How does she know me?" The question was sharp but not cruel, shaded with pain. If Marcus had expected anger, he did not get it. He got a man who was trying to find the logic that linked a stranger's parcel to his child's keepsake. Claire's mouth was a thin line. "Perhaps someone is trying to make trouble," she said, the sentence polished by practice. She wanted to direct the story away from her husband's vulnerability and back into the safe lanes of reputation. Her gaze at Marcus hardened into something that could be controlled. If you control the narrative, you control the damage. Anna intervened gently, the way one unwraps a tense knot. "We should not jump to conclusions," she said. Her voice was the practical tone of someone used to defusing tempers and smoothing luggage claims. She suggested calling the airline's security office or arranging a private conversation. The words were small and sensible, but behind them was a moral compass that tilted toward protection of the child, of the truth of whoever needed it most. Marcus felt the pressure of eyes, of possible outcomes playing themselves out in his mind: arrest, accusation, humiliation. He thought of Rosa and how he would explain. He thought of his sister and how he could not bring her pain. He tried to measure how much of himself he could afford to risk in telling the truth. His life had taught him the arithmetic of risk. Small choices, weighed carefully, could keep a roof overhead. His hands tightened on Jacob for a moment, as if to count those tiny risks. Edward's reaction to the locket moved like particles of reaction. At times he wanted to demand answers, to pull Marcus into the light of his wealth and test him. At others, he merely watched, the baby between them a living, complicating presence. He knew that he had to protect Jacob. He also knew that whatever truth lay in that locket might not be something money could buy away. The conflict inside him was a private war between the need to control and the dawning awareness that control was slipping. Claire whispered to one of the assistants. The assistant's face was blank, but his eyes darted like a man trained to collect information. Anna watched them exchange words, small signals that built into plans, private rooms, security checks, discreet calls. Bureaucracy arrived like a tide, ready to sweep the scene into procedures that felt like safety, but sometimes hid their own cruelties. Marcus spoke less now, listening as others moved the story into boxes. Listening was, for him, a way of keeping truth close. He knew that people would read him as either a helper or a threat, depending on the lean of their assumptions. The narrator, both the compassionate and the distant, sees him in layers. A young man whose life has taught him to give care freely, and a potential suspect in the eyes of those who read his clothes before his heart. Edward's face, when he held Jacob again, settled into a shape the world would find familiar, the worried father. But underneath it, an old ledger of choices flickered, names, nights, perhaps a regret that a lost locket could now reopen. Claire's eyes caught that ledger and wanted to burn it closed, but she had no match. Her power was small and social. She had to use it like a blade that must be hidden when not needed. The scene tightened into tension that could be untied only by truth or by creative deceit. Each character guarded something. Marcus, his honesty and his fragile hope. Edward, his family's reputation and the pieces of a past he wanted to keep private. Claire, her curated life and her fear of exposure. Anna, a professional duty that twined with a private sympathy. Between them, a fragile alliance could form, or a fracture could widen. The narrator waits on the edge, feeling the tug of what each might reveal, knowing that the next words could be a caress or a blow. Marcus did not expect the photo to turn his whole world inside out. He had held the locket like a strange coin, feeling its chill, listening to the hum of other people's lives. But when Edward opened it and the small picture caught the light, something in Marcus's chest folded as if a page had been turned back to a memory he had not known he kept. The photograph was thin with age and salt, the edges softened as if it had been carried in a pocket through summers. A man laughed with a child on his shoulders. Both of them looked like they belonged to a bright, careless day by the sea. The smile on the man's face was a smile Marcus had seen before, an old smile printed once on a faded box of matches at his mother's house. It was the same neat line near the mouth, the same way the eyes creased. Marcus's breath snagged. His fingers moved before his head could order them. He reached out and touched the photograph with the gentleness of someone who might be handling a relic. Edward's hand stilled, and Claire's face, which had been sharpened into polite control, lost something of its armor. Marcus felt, without understanding why, that the air had shifted under him. "Where did you get that?" Marcus asked. His voice sounded small to his own ears, like a child trying to call a name that had been hidden. Edward looked at him with a new, startled frankness. He stopped. The word tasted strange and private. "It's Jacob's," he said finally. "It was from when he was small." He kept his voice low, as if the photograph were a confession. Marcus's mind rushed through rooms of the past. He thought of a seaside he had never been to, but that his mother described sometimes when she was tired and the words fell like small bright stones. Her stories about a man who had taken him for an afternoon and laughed like light. He thought of his mother's hands making bread and the way she had traced a circle on the table with a finger any time a certain name came up and then stopped. He remembered a broken watch his mother kept in a drawer and a note folded in the back of a Bible that had been handed down, never read out loud. "You know him?" Edward asked suddenly, as if he had been pulled from deep water. Marcus's mouth was dry. He had not known the man in the photo could belong to him. But the old, stubborn part of him, those years of scavenging bits of truth from margins, knew when a thread matched the weave of history. Marcus swallowed and let a question that had been whispering all his life find shape. "Who is the man with the child?" Edward's hand clenched around the locket as though the metal might cut. He hesitated, as if choosing which private map to lay on the table. "That was a long time ago," he said, finally, before things changed. He looked at Claire, with a look that pleaded for the privacy of his past. Claire's painted face was pale, not with anger but with an uncomplicated squeeze of fear. Marcus's memory was a slow-moving thing now, a film that flickered between frames, his mother laughing once through tears, a name she never said, a small lullaby she hummed that pulled at Marcus's throat in the night. He felt a cold weight settle beneath his ribs, the possibility that this photograph was more than proof of a lost afternoon. He had grown with the quiet of questions and small notices. The matchbox smile, the scratched watch, all those little things that had seemed like thrift store ornaments now aligned. "Edward," Marcus said, and his voice was careful, "did you ever know a woman named Mary? Mary Johnson?" The world seemed to pause for a breath. Edward's eyes widened with something like recognition before he smoothed his face into composure. "Mary," he repeated. "Yes, a long time ago. He stopped, and the stop sounded like a door closing on a room he would not have opened in company. Marcus had not known his mother's first name in detail until he was old enough to listen to the small, soft notes left in cupboards and then read the handwriting on the Bible's margins. He thought of the curls of ink he had seen years ago and that he had not understood. The truth is unspooled like a low, quiet alarm. "She was my mother," Marcus said before he could think how the words might fall. Silence stretched, elastic and tender. People around them shifted, sensing a wave in the water. Anna stepped closer, expression folding into worried interest. Claire's lips parted as if to form an accusation and then closed. Whatever plan she had been holding slipped in her hands. Edward began. The sentence broke like thin glass. For a moment, he simply looked at Marcus, and Marcus read the ledger in the man's eyes, the long columns of choices, the weight of things no ledger could balance. "I didn't know." He swallowed. His mouth worked like a man who had swallowed a bitter pill. Marcus felt the rose of heat in his face, the hot shame that sometimes follows truth. He had never wanted pity. He had wanted bread and a clean shirt and a life that did not require invisible labor. But the way the airport light fell on the locket, the way the photograph matched pieces of his own past, felt like a betrayal and an answer at the same time. Then Rosa's name slid into the quiet like a small, sharp stone thrown into a still pool. Marcus thought of her soft hands, the way she had pressed the parcel into his palms with a smile that had seemed like charity. He thought of the favor he had done and the coin of gratitude that had paid him, an ordinary, unremarkable thing. He turned to find Rosa standing at the edge of the group, her eyes bright with a feverish heat. She had followed at a distance, hoping perhaps for thanks, perhaps for the safety of witnesses. When Marcus looked at her, something in her face did not look surprising. Instead, she bore an odd, resigned calm, the kind of settled look someone wears when they have set a plan in motion and watched it take shape. "Rosa," Marcus said, and the name seemed suddenly thin. Rosa stepped forward, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were pale. "I'm sorry," she said, and the sound of her apology was a soft, brittle thing. She did not attempt to hide the truth. "I asked you to carry the parcel because I hoped it would make him notice." "Notice what?" Marcus asked, rage and heartbreak braided into the question. He could feel the betrayal like an ache under his ribs. Rosa had used him. She had given him a favor that was not a favor, but a trap. Rosa's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I knew Mary," she said. "We worked together. She told me things about him, about how he left, about promises never kept. I thought," her voice trembled, "I thought if he saw the locket, if he saw the picture, maybe he would remember. Maybe he would do the right thing for your mother. For you." Her words poured out like a small, desperate confession. I didn't think about how it would look for you." Marcus felt the ground shift under his feet. The betrayal was not born of malice, so much as of a raw, personal logic that had used him as a tool. Rosa had decided to pull at an old thread and hoped the whole seam would open. She had chosen Marcus because she trusted his honesty, not because she thought of him as a chess piece. That made the wound more complicated, less a knife and more a misplaced kindness. Edward's voice was low and strained. "You used him?" he asked Rosa, but there was no accusation in it that satisfied Marcus. There was only the small, private hurt of a man who had not anticipated his past coming home in the hands of a stranger. Rosa nodded. "I thought it would make him see. I thought it would make him come back." Her confession was a small, dangerous thing. She had broken trust to fix what she felt had been broken all along. In the hush that followed, Marcus realized his path had been altered by forces he had not known existed. He had been a messenger, a helper, nothing more, until the locket made his life a ledger and then a reckoning. The airport seemed to tilt. People's faces were maps with new routes. He had been used as bait, yes, but in that use there was also a doorway. The truth had arrived, messy and unwanted, and it forced him to choose what to do with it. He held Jacob a little tighter and felt the child's heartbeat, steady and unaware. The betrayal throbbed under his skin, but beneath it, something else pulsed, an unexpected possibility, a dangerous and fragile hope. If Edward might be the father Marcus had not known he had, then a life of small debts could become a life measured differently. But the path from a locket and a photograph to something honest would be hard, full of angry rooms and questions that left scars. Rosa had betrayed him by using him as her instrument, but she had also pulled at a hidden seam and let an old truth show itself. Marcus did not know whether to scream or to weep. He only knew that his world, which had been a narrow lane of survival, had opened to a wider road lined with thorns and possibilities. The first twist of the story had been pulled, and everything that followed would have to reckon with who Marcus might be if he dared to believe it. The cabin had emptied of small talk, but kept its heat. People shuffled in a new order, some looking away, some leaning forward as if drama were a lens that sharpened everything. The engines breathed under the plane like a sleeping animal. Marcus felt the hum against his ribs and held Jacob closer, as if the white blanket between them might be a thin, fragile wall against the world. Security had moved them into a small, windowless room with chairs bolted to the floor and a clock that ticked too loud. The light there was white and truthful in a way that made skin look thin. Marcus sat Jacob in his lap and watched Edward move like a man trying on shame for the first time. Claire hovered near the doorway, arms folded, as if the posture could hold the shape of the family intact. Anna stood by Marcus with a quiet that felt like a steady hand on the small of his back. The questions began small and then sharpened. Security officers asked where Marcus had picked up the parcel, who had given it to him, why he was carrying a child. Marcus told the truth. Rosa had asked him, he had agreed, but each truthful answer seemed only to crease the fabric of his life further. The officers' faces were polite, but clinical. Their pens made neat columns that might one day become a record he could not erase. Edward's legal advisor arrived like a shadow in a suit. He spoke with careful softness and the tone of a man who could arrange the world into acceptable shapes. We need to understand exactly how this happened, the lawyer said. His eyes flicked to Marcus, then to the locket, as if each item might be evidence in an invisible scale. Marcus felt watched and judged by systems that had never needed to know his name. Claire's voice cut through the air, sharp, rehearsed. I will not have rumors, she said. Not now. Not ever. Her demand was a blade wrapped in velvet. She glanced at Edward with something that looked like contempt softened into worry. We need discretion, she added. We need this handled quietly. Edward's jaw worked. He looked torn in a way Marcus had not yet seen. Part of him wanted to smooth things with money and silence. Part wanted to know the truth no matter how ugly. The contradiction made him look older than his years, as if time had stamped lines on his conscience and then asked him to clean them away. The lawyer leaned in and spoke low. Mr. Lancaster is prepared to cooperate, but we must be careful. There are reputations at stake. He did not finish. His implication hung. Pay enough and troubles shrink, refuse, and the machine of exposure spins. Marcus felt something cold at the back of his throat. He had spent his life avoiding the kind of attention that asked for proof and paper. Now, the cost of silence was being measured in dollars and calculated in the faces of people who had never had to count pennies. The lawyer's offer, though not made in numbers, had a tone. Hush and the world would forget you. Stand firm for truth, and you might lose everything you had managed to hold. Rosa sat nearby, hands clenched in her lap. Her face had an open, fevered look, as if confession had been a physical act that left heat behind. She kept glancing at Marcus as if she wanted to climb inside his skin and fix what she had broken. I did it because I thought it would make him come back, she said, voice small. I thought if he remembered. Her sentence broke, and the room breathed around the silence that followed. Marcus's sister's face, small and tired, rose in his imagination. Her cough in the night, her hand pressing at his wrist to ask for more coins for medicine. He thought of her first because small debts live loud in people who have to choose between food and medicine. The lawyer's quiet offer sounded like a knife. Take this and you'll never have to see the weight of the world. But Marcus knew what taking it would feel like, complicity in a lie larger than himself. Anna watched him with a look that held no calculation, only human concern. You don't have to decide now, she said softly, but you should know what's at stake. Her words were a small buoy in the room. Marcus wanted to ask for help, but his pride was a quiet animal that would only come if coaxed. Edward's hand hovered over Jacob and then withdrew. He watched Marcus the way a man watches a weather report he does not understand, apprehensive and hopeful in one breath. If I offered to help your family, he said, voice thin, would you accept? Not to buy your silence, just to help them. I want to make sure. He could not finish without the lawyer's trained attention slicing his intent into safe pieces. Marcus felt the question as a trap disguised as kindness. Money could pay rent. It could buy medicine. It could make his sister's nights less noisy with pain. But it could also bury a truth that might be his only chance at something larger. A name, a place in a life that had always been anonymous. He thought of the locket's photograph beside his mother's faded things at home. He thought about the way a child at the table asks simple questions. Who am I? Where do I come from? And how those questions matter when answers are rare. He saw Claire watching him, jaw tight. She wanted this gone, not because of Jacob alone, but for the fragile veneer of a life that could crack under public scrutiny. She had power. She had the habit of using it like a shield. She would not understand the arithmetic of Marcus's hunger. To her, money was a solvent that fixed stains. The lawyer placed an envelope on the table, sliding it gently across polished hands, as if the paper itself might be the instrument of mercy. Marcus did not touch it. The paper looked like promise and poison at once. Anna's fingers twined in her lap. Her face had a line of anger now, not at Marcus, but at the ease with which systems presume to negotiate human lives. "You can't buy what you don't understand," she said without turning to anyone in particular. The room's air turned thin. Marcus felt the pressure of choices, like weather bearing down. One path that promised short-term relief, one that asked for truth at the cost of pain and exposure. He thought of Rosa's betrayal and its muddy kindness. She had used him because she loved a memory and wanted repair. But love born of deception still cuts. Outside, the runway lights blinked like small, indifferent stars. Inside, the clock ticked, demanding decisions. Marcus felt the baby's heartbeat under his palm, steady and blind to the politics around him. For a moment, he imagined Jacob growing up, knowing the name of the man who had fathered him, or never knowing. The image stung. Marcus's hands closed around a decision not yet made. He would not let money be the shutter that closed the window on his past. Not because he was noble, he was not sure he deserved the word, but because some truths, once discovered, ask to be acknowledged. They do not accept tidy endings bought at a price. He looked up at Edward, eyes steady for the first time that day. "If you want to help," Marcus said, voice small but firm, "help by telling the truth. Help by answering questions, not by offering envelopes. If you care for Jacob, show it by being honest." Silence folded the room. Claire's face tightened into a mask. The lawyer's jaw set. Edward's lips parted like someone hearing a gauntlet thrown. For a breath, the world held its balance on Marcus's words. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Lancaster will cooperate," he said, words shaped to calm. "But we must manage this carefully." Marcus realized then that the real war had not been between him and the rich man. It was between two ways of thinking, one that valued control and neat endings, and one that understood that truth is messy and often expensive. He did not know if his choice would lead to doors opening or to ruin. He only knew he could not accept silence bought with currency. Anna squeezed his shoulder once, a steadying touch. Rosa began to cry quietly in the corner, the sound raw and ashamed. Edward sat back, looking as if he had been struck. The envelope on the table seemed to pulse with a promise it did not have the right to make. Outside the locked doors, somewhere in the belly of the plane, a voice announced a delayed departure. The engines hummed, waiting. Inside the room, Marcus held Jacob and felt the future bend like a branch underweight. Choices had been set in motion. The next move would come from someone who had everything to lose and someone who had nothing but truth and hope. The stakes had been raised. The world had grown colder and sharper around them. The small room smelled of stale coffee and airline cleaner, but outside the glass the sky had gone a hard, angry gray. Rain began to slap at the terminal windows like fingers trying to get attention. The light in the room flattened faces into plates of feeling, sharp, plain, impossible to avoid. The crew from security stood at the doorway, like witnesses waiting for a verdict. Somewhere beyond the doors, passengers drifted past as if nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Marcus held Jacob, so the baby's breath bumped softly against his shirt. He felt it was like a promise and a question at once. He could not know how the next minutes would bend his life. He could only hold warmth in his arms and the cold in his chest and wait for the truth to come down like rain. Edward sat across from him, his suit rumpled as if the fabric were tired of holding secrets. He looked older than the photographs the locket had contained. The man who usually measured the world with a calm, precise hand was trembling now in a way that made him look real enough to hurt. Beside him, Claire's painted calm had frayed into something like steel wire, hard and ready to cut. The lawyer hovered near her shoulder like a train shadow. Anna stood by Marcus with a steady, humane expression, her fingers pressed to her lanyard, as if it were a rosary. "Tell me everything," Marcus said. His voice did not shout. It did not have to. It was the voice of someone asking for the bones of his life. Edward swallowed. The rain on the glass blurred the world outside into a moving watercolor. He leaned forward, and the room narrowed around his confession the way a camera closes, on a face. "Years ago," he began, "before Claire and I married, he stopped as if the shape of the sentence bit him. Marcus felt a rustle of memory move through him. Months of small no-names and a single name. Mary arranged themselves like a map. "You knew my mother," Marcus said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 small nights, of hunger, of whispering questions. Edward nodded. "I did." The admission dropped like a stone. "Mary and I, there was a time. We were young. I left." The phrase landed like a fist. "I thought I was doing what I had to do. I thought I was giving her a chance by leaving. He could not finish in a neat sentence. His voice cracked. "I never knew about Marcus. I never knew Mary had you." Marcus felt the world tilt. The part of him that had always counted days and coins searched for a reason to understand what had been done to his history. He had expected anger, maybe, but what steadied him now was only the need for truth. Claire's mouth tightened like a drawn wire. The hard edge of her came forward, and she did something Marcus had not expected. She rose and spoke with a voice that had been trained to smooth and to steer. "I knew about Mary," she said, and the room sucked in its breath. "I knew because Edward told me once, long before we were married. He said it was foolishness, a moment he regretted. He asked me to forget it." Her eyes flicked to Edward and then to Marcus with a look that was both accusation and confession. "I thought keeping the past closed would protect our family." The second twist landed then, with the slow certainty of something that had been planned and hidden. "You knew," Edward repeated. "You knew, and you kept it?" His voice tasted of betrayal. Claire's hands clenched around her clutch. "I kept things," she said. "I arranged for letters to be intercepted. I paid to have idle gossip silenced. I thought," her voice curdled, "I thought the past would ruin us if it came out. I did it for Jacob, for our life." Her eyes were cold, but the cold had a jagged edge now, fear and the crisp regret of someone whose careful house had been set on fire by its own matches. Rosa was suddenly at the doorway, an outline in the rain. She came into the light like someone who had decided to stop hiding. Marcus watched her, pulse a drum in his throat. "I was the one who gave Marcus the parcel," she said softly. Her voice had the quality of someone who had wrestled the conscience until it bled. "I wanted him to have proof. I wanted Edward to remember Mary. I thought if he saw the locket, if he felt the shame, he would do right by them." The room had become a courtroom for small, private reasons. Each person had a motive, a sin of fear. The lawyer stepped forward, smooth as always, and placed a stack of papers on the table. "We can manage this," he said, offering the usual solution as if it were a bandage. "An agreement, confidentiality, financial assistance." Edward's hand slammed on the table as if the slap would make the air clearer. "No," the single word cracked the room open. "No, I will not buy silence. I will not let the truth be buried because it is easier. I made mistakes. I left. I was young, selfish, and afraid. But this," he looked at Marcus with a heat that stunned the room. "If he is my son, I will not hide it." Claire's face went a color Marcus had not seen before, white as a page. "You can't be serious," she said. "Think of Jacob. Think of what this would do to him. To us. To our reputation. To the company." Edward's voice was steady now with a clarity that seemed to surprise even himself. "Reputation is not a life. Jacob is a life. Marcus here," he pointed with a hand that shook. "He is a life I had no right to ignore. I will answer for what I did. I will do what I must." Then Claire did the thing that made the room collapse into the real core of betrayal. She reached into her bag and handed the lawyer a small envelope. Then, "You'll do what is right," she said quietly to Marcus and to Edward both. "But you will do it on our terms." The envelope's presence was a knife disguised as an olive branch. "We can arrange for support," she said. "We can avoid scandal. We can keep Jacob safe." Edward stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he could not translate. "You withheld letters," he said. "You intercepted her attempts. You actively kept me from knowing." Claire's eyes shone not with tears, but with something colder, self-preservation that had calcified into cruelty. "I did what I had to. I protected our family." Rose's face broke. "She paid me," she said. "She paid to make sure Mary's letters never reached him. She promised me money. I thought it was right. I thought she would help them, quietly. But it was not enough. I tried to do good in a small way, and I made it worse." The second betrayal, the one that sharpened and split, was Claire's. She had not only hidden the truth, but had actively arranged the lives so Edward remained blind. She had decided whose pain was tolerable and whose was not. Marcus felt both fury and a strange, strange pity for a woman who had fortified herself with other people's faults. Edward's shoulders hunched. "Why?" he asked. The word was tiny in a room gone suddenly raw. "For fear," Claire said simply. "Fear of ruin. Fear of what my life would become if the past had roots. I thought silence was kindness. I thought being without truth was protection." Anna's hand, steady for hours, now trembled. She had seen too many small lives damaged by the decisions of those with power. She stepped forward, voice plain and sharp. "Protection that hurts others is not protection. It is cowardice wrapped in nice paper." The lawyer, sensing the collapse of the plan, tried to salvage something practical, but Marcus cut him off. He could feel the weight of everything behind him, his mother's memory, his sister's cough, the ledger of small debts he owed to people who had helped him scrape by. He looked at Edward with something like awful hope. "If you want to help my family," he said, "help by being truthful. Help by being a father. Don't hide behind envelopes." Edward's eyes filled. He rose and stepped forward, and the two men stood close enough that water from the rain would have found them. He put a hand, uncertain at first, then firmer, on Marcus's shoulder. The contact was small, human, and it shook Marcus to his bones. "I can't change the past," Edward said, "but I can be part of your future if you'll have me. I don't want to cover things up. I don't want money to decide what's true." His face had the rawness of someone who had at last chosen shame for the sake of repair. Claire's mouth quivered as if she might say more, but the words fell back like stones she could not throw. The lawyer gathered papers and left. Claire stood very still, her empire of small manipulations uncovered and useless against the tide of truth. She looked at Edward with a final bitterness that was almost animal and walked out into the rain without a word. Outside the room, the terminal lights blurred under the rain like a city suddenly sobered. Inside, the plane's engines hummed a distant, indifferent score. Anna sat down softly, exhaling a breath she had kept in her chest all day. Rosa knelt and touched Marcus's hand with a shaking apology. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wanted to help." Marcus looked at Edward, at the man who had, through error or cowardice, missed whole years of life, and then at Jacob sleeping against his shoulder, ignorant of grown things and grown betrayals. He felt something open and fragile inside him. The possibility of a father who would try, the possibility of a family remade by truth rather than kept whole by lies. Edward's first, clumsy words toward Marcus were not law or promise, but the sound of a man who had finally chosen. "I will be there," he said. "I will learn. I will answer. I will help Mary's family. I will be your father if you want me to be." Marcus did not answer with the neatness some stories offer. He let himself breathe. The narrator, one voice tender, one steady, watched as a moment folded into another. A man choosing honesty, a woman left to her own conscience. A poor boy offered a place at a table he never expected to sit at. The rain slid down the windows, and the plane waited, patient as fate. The truth had cost something. Claire's betrayal had cost her the control she had fought to keep. But in the small, honest space that followed, something else had been bought, messy and expensive and human, a chance for repair. Marcus held Jacob and felt, for the first time in a long while, that names might be spoken aloud in the future without fear. The days after the airport moved like a slow tide. News did not sweep them up the way it might have in other lives. The story was too small for headlines and too large for simple endings. Marcus kept his hours the way he always had, work at dawn, shifts that paid in cash and in the kind of dignity you earn by being useful. But the rhythm of his days had a new measure now. There were meetings with lawyers, and quietly with Edward, there were phone calls that came wrapped in apology and offers of help, and there were others that carried the stiff politeness of people who find themselves near a scandal and would rather not be. Edward arrived at the small apartment Marcus shared with his sister, with an awkward care that belonged to a man learning to cross a narrow bridge for the first time. He brought food that smelled of spices Marcus's sister had missed, and a folder with papers about work opportunities and programs for education. At first, their conversations were inventory. Names, dates, promises to be checked and kept. Edward listened more than he spoke, as if he was trying to learn the grammar of a life he had missed. Marcus watched him and felt a cautiousness that was not only about money. He had kept himself whole by measuring trust in small things, watching whether promises happened, watching whether people came when they said they would. Edward's first tests were small. He arrived on time. He showed up at the clinic when Marcus's sister needed a consultation. He sat with Marcus through a long, dull meeting about paternity rights and did not try to buy away the difficult paperwork with flashy checks. Each small act stacked into something that felt like intention. Claire did not return to the life she had before. She left their house. At least, she left the version of it she had made in careful papers and polite calls. The company reassigned her role to another city, a move wrapped in plausible business language. Whether it was punishment or escape depended on who told the story. She did not come back to apologize. Her absence felt like a torn page that would not be glued. The narrator notes this without triumph. Sometimes people choose their own exile when the cost of staying is honesty. Rosa visited often. She carried herself with a new kind of humility, the sort that comes from seeing how a good intention can become a wound. She worked double shifts and left small packages of food at Marcus's door, things that said, without words, "I'm sorry and I remember." Marcus forgave her in the slow, practical way forgiveness often happens, by accepting the help when he needed it, by nodding at her apologies without dressing them in a medal. He understood she had acted from love for his mother, a love that had been fierce and blind. He could not unmake what she had done, but he could choose how to carry it forward. Jacob grew, oblivious to the adult maps that had been redrawn for him. He learned the funny faces Marcus made to make him laugh, the slow rhythm Marcus used to help him sleep. Edward came to those nights sometimes, and each arrival felt like a small piece of history trying to fit into the shape of a present. Edward learned how to change a diaper, how to sing a lullaby that did not come naturally to him at first, but that in time felt less like performance and more like practice. That was the work, not the grand gestures, but the repetition of presence. Marcus had nights when the ledger of his life whispered to him, "Memory is not kind. It tends to ask questions that do not have clean answers." He found himself thinking of the nights his mother had been lonely, of the small omissions that had become large over time. He wrestled with a moral knot. Had he been forgiven by truth alone? Did Edward's admission absolve the years of absence? Was Rosa's deception an act of mercy or manipulation? The narrator leans in here with empathy. These questions are not meant to be answered in a single speech. They unspool over tea, over hard conversations, over the slow seasons of living. There were moments of bitterness. Marcus caught himself imagining a life where his mother had simply been told the truth earlier, where doors had not been closed by envelopes and intercepted letters. He pictured Claire's intervention as a fence between people and their rights to know, and sometimes he wanted to shout about the small cruelties power permits. But he also felt something else, the surprising, stubborn tenderness of being seen. If Edward meant to be part of his life, it was a thing that had to be built, nail by careful nail. When Marcus finally allowed himself to talk openly, really openly, with Edward, they sat at a cheap kitchen table and traded memories like old tools. Edward spoke of a younger man who had been frightened of poverty and of a choice made in panic. He spoke of regret that had lived like a shadow. Marcus spoke of nights of hunger and of a mother who had smiled even when the cupboards were empty. They did not tidy the past into neat confessions. They set the pieces out and handled them, slow and careful. There was a day when Edward took Marcus by the shoulder and said, simply, "I don't expect you to forgive me quickly. I only want to try." The plainness of the sentence was its power. Marcus thought of all the small acts required for trust: arriving when you say you will, answering a call, sitting while someone cries. He said, "Then do the work." It was not a dramatic verdict. It was the beginning of an agreement to watch each other for truth. The community around them shifted, too. Anna kept in touch in the way that people who are good at carrying other people's burdens know how, with practical kindness. She arranged for Marcus to meet a counselor who helped him talk about the years of small humiliations that build into a larger shape. She set up a meeting with a training program that could give him skills beyond the airport. The small levers of assistance were like mortar between bricks. They did not solve everything, but they made building possible. In the quiet moments, Marcus reflected on what he had learned about truth, mercy, and cost. Truth, he saw, is a raw thing. It strips away the ease of pretense and forces people to stand in the light. Mercy, he learned, is not always an easy virtue. Sometimes it requires courage, and sometimes it involves saying no to convenient silences. Cost is not only measured in money, but in the slow work of apologizing, of making space for pain, and of choosing presence over avoidance. His final decision was not dramatic. There was no grand reconciliation ceremony. Instead, on a cool morning, Marcus walked with his sister to the clinic without an envelope from anyone. Edward met them there and sat in the waiting room with hands in his lap, not flashy, not performative. When his sister left with a new prescription and a lighter step, Marcus felt a small permission to hope. He realized that the moral of his life would not be written by one moment of confession or one envelope pushed across a table. It would be written in years of showing up. The narrator offers one last, tender observation. Life does not tidy itself into moral lessons. It hands you a messy bundle and asks you what you'll do. Marcus chose day by day to let the truth stand and to let people prove themselves through action. He held Jacob, worked his shifts, accepted help when it was honest, and refused it when it came disguised as a purchase of silence. He forgave some, kept firm boundaries with others, and learned how to make a life that contained both pain and footholds for repair. On an evening when rain had stopped and the sky was clean, Marcus watched Edward and Jacob play in the small park across the street. Jacob laughed with the unself-conscious joy of a child who does not yet know the architecture of grown mistakes. Edward, awkward and earnest, tried to teach him how to kick a ball. Marcus felt a quiet swell behind his ribs, not triumph, not absolute trust, but a careful relief. The world had not been made pure by confession. It had been offered a chance to be more honest. He folded that relief into his pocket like a small coin. Practical, not mythical, and walked home with his sister's hand in his. The future was not promised. It never is. But there was now a place at a table that had once been closed, and that place had been earned not by envelopes or secrets, but by the slow, difficult work of facing what had been hidden and choosing to act differently because of it. So, tell me if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.